Daniel Reeves wasn't just climbing Everest for glory, he was climbing to escape his demons. In 2018, he vanished high in the death zone, swallowed by the ice. For 2 years, no one knew if he slipped, froze, or simply gave up. Then, a team of climbers uncovered his body, frozen solid, sitting upright, clutching a battered journal in his hands. But what was inside that journal stunned everyone. It wasn't just climbing notes. It was his final battle with himself. And his last words, written days before his death, revealed something no one could have imagined. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The morning began like any other, quiet, calm, ordinary. But by nightfall, whispers would ripple across the village, whispers that would never fade. It started with silence. A man, respected, flawed, but determined, failed to return home. No note, no sound, no farewell. His absence wasn't loud. It was subtle, like a chair left pulled out at the table, or a jacket hanging by the door with no owner to claim it. At first, people assumed it was nothing. Maybe he lingered too long at the edge of town. Maybe he stopped for a drink. Maybe he wanted space. But when the sun sank and shadows swallowed the streets, unease spread. Neighbors gathered in hushed tones. 2 women at the corner shop leaned close, whispering behind cupped hands. "You know he's been restless lately," one said, eyes darting around. Restless? Or reckless? Men like that don't just disappear for no reason. The gossip swelled. By lantern light, men speculated at the tavern. "I bet he's chasing something again," one scoffed. "Dreams too big for his boots," another leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Or maybe he found something he didn't want us to see." Meanwhile, his family searched the edges of their home. A watch left on the nightstand, a journal with its last page unfinished, his boots missing, but his old hat still resting on the hook. Details that meant nothing on their own, but together, they screamed absence. By midnight, the village moved from concern to suspicion. Some called him irresponsible, others feared he had been taken, but none of them knew the truth. Not yet. The whispers of that first night would stretch into weeks. Posters pinned on wooden poles, flyers nailed to door frames. The inked word "missing" stared back at strangers who passed through town. And still nothing. No sightings, no messages, no signs of struggle. Just emptiness. The gossip only deepened. "If you ask me," one man muttered at the bakery, he finally ran from his failures. "Failures?" another countered. "You don't vanish into thin air because of shame." Something darker happened, and the darker it sounded, the more people leaned in. The man had always been restless, true. He had a hunger for something beyond the horizon, a hunger that often left him broke, mocked, and dismissed. Yet this time felt different. His vanishing wasn't an act of escape. It was an act of fate. As days bled into weeks, the search dwindled. The posters curled in the rain. The lanterns burned out. People moved on. His name became nothing more than a story told at market stalls, a cautionary tale for the ambitious. But fate wasn't finished with him, because while the village slept, while they gossiped and moved on, he was out there, somewhere far from home, and his story was only just beginning. For 2 years, his name floated in silence. The posters were gone, the flyers forgotten, and the gossip had dulled into memory. People barely spoke of him anymore, except in passing, like a ghost they once thought they knew. But fate has a way of resurfacing what the earth tries to bury. It began with a rumor. A group of climbers descending from the higher slopes of Mount Everest stumbled across something strange. At first, it was just another frozen shape hidden beneath ice and snow. Everest holds many secrets, bodies preserved in silence, frozen like statues marking the mountain's cruelty. But this one was different. They found him sitting upright, his face half hidden by frost, his body sealed in ice like glass. His gloved hands were clutching something, not rope, not gear, but a journal, pressed tight against his chest as if it were his last possession, his final defense. The news spread quickly. A recovery team was called. Word traveled down the mountain, then across villages, then through the airwaves. People who had long forgotten his name suddenly remembered. The whispers returned. 2 Sherpas, resting in a tent at base camp, exchanged low voices. "They say his body is untouched, like he's still breathing in the ice." No. The mountain doesn't give life. It takes it. But if he's holding that journal, maybe it has the truth we never saw. When the rescue team carefully pried the journal from his frozen grasp, the cover cracked like brittle wood. Pages stiff with frost began to peel open, revealing lines of ink that had bled and blurred, but not enough to erase the words. And suddenly the narrative changed. This wasn't just another lost climber swallowed by Everest. This was a man who had left behind his own story. As the journal dried, the words came alive. He had written of his battles, not with snow or altitude, but with himself. Struggles that had shadowed him long before he set foot on Everest. Failures he carried like stones on his back. Regrets that stalked him at night. But laced within those pages was something more: determination. A fire that refused to die. He wrote of his desire to be more than his mistakes, to climb higher than his fears. He gave himself a task, to face Everest, not for glory, not for others, but for himself. The rescuers were quiet as they read. Even hardened climbers, used to finding bodies on the slopes, felt the weight of his words. Back in the village, when the journal's existence was revealed, the gossip turned again. At the cafe, two men leaned in. So he wasn't running after all. He was fighting. The other shook his head. Or maybe both. Fighting himself. Running from himself. That's a battle none of us can see. For the first time in years, the man wasn't just a vanished figure. He was flesh, blood, and words. A body frozen in time, clutching the last fragments of his soul. And the discovery of that journal wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of an entirely new one. Because within those words, buried in frost and pain, lay the map of his inner world, and the truth about why he climbed into the sky and never returned. The journal was stiff, its leather cover cracked and brittle from years locked in ice. When rescuers first unfolded it, the pages clung together, stiff with frost, yet still intact, as if the mountain itself had protected his words. It wasn't a climber's log. No coordinates, no gear notes, no maps of routes. It was something else entirely. The first entries were raw, almost confessional. Daniel wrote about the silence in his apartment back home in Colorado, how the nights stretched longer than the days, how sometimes he'd wake up staring at the ceiling, asking himself why he still kept trying. He admitted failures, broken friendships, lost chances. He wrote about the heaviness he carried inside, the kind no one else could see. One entry read, "I've spent so much time feeling like a ghost in my own life. I'm tired of running from it. I want to prove, at least once, that I can face something bigger than my fears." He described Everest not just as a mountain, but as a mirror. Each step up the ice was a step into himself. Each breath in the thin air was like fighting the weight of his own doubts. As the journal continued, the tone shifted. He began writing less about despair and more about grit. His words sharpened. He wrote about training in the early mornings, pushing his body when his mind wanted to quit. He admitted how scared he was, but he also wrote about determination, a stubborn fire that refused to burn out. In one entry, he confessed, "I don't know if I'll survive this climb, but I do know this. If I turn back, if I quit before I try, then I'll always be that man who hid from himself. I can't live with that." For those who read it, it was haunting. This wasn't the diary of someone seeking glory. It wasn't about fame or record books. It was the words of a man wrestling with shadows. And yet, there were glimpses of hope. Small moments he captured in detail. He wrote about sitting by a campfire with fellow climbers, trading stories while snow hissed against the tents. He described the crunch of boots in snow, the glow of dawn breaking over the ridges, the smell of melted ice water laced with tea leaves. These fragments of life glimmered like tiny sparks in the darkness. People whispered about it. In the village taverns, in base camp tents, conversations circled. So he wasn't climbing for fame? No. He was climbing because he needed to prove something to himself. That's worse than chasing glory. It's like fighting an enemy no one else can see. The journal grew heavier with each page. By the final chapters, his words carried both exhaustion and pride. He wrote of the altitude pressing down on him, the cold gnawing through layers of gear, the loneliness of nights where all he heard was the wind. But then he'd end the entry with a note of fire, as if writing itself was his way of refusing to give in. The deeper they read, the clearer it became. Daniel Reeves wasn't just documenting a climb. He was leaving behind a message, not to others, but to himself. A record that, win or lose, he had fought. One of his last reflections read, "I used to think success was reaching the summit. Now I realize success is in the climb itself, in every step I take, in every fear I face. If I die here, let it be known I died trying to live." Those words lingered. They carried more weight than the ice, more power than the peak, because in them, Daniel revealed something many never dare admit, that sometimes the hardest mountain to climb isn't the one covered in snow and rock, it's the one inside ourselves. And with each entry his voice seemed closer, as if he were whispering from the past, carried on the thin winds of Everest. But it was his final entry, scribbled days before he vanished, that held the greatest weight of all. And that entry would define the man he truly was. The final pages of Daniel's journal were different. The handwriting wasn't neat anymore. It wavered, jagged, as if each letter had been fought for in the thin, freezing air. The ink bled in places, smeared by trembling hands. You could almost picture him hunched in his tent, frost clinging to his beard, the sound of the wind clawing at the canvas as he wrote by the flicker of a fading headlamp. The date was clear, May 9th, 2018, just 2 days before the storms rolled in, and he vanished. His entry began with a simple line, "The mountain doesn't scare me anymore. The silence does." He wrote about how the higher he climbed, the quieter the world became. No birds, no rushing streams, no laughter from fellow climbers. Just the creak of ice shifting under his boots and the constant roar of wind. In that silence, he confessed, his inner fears screamed the loudest. Still, there was no bitterness in the words. Instead, there was resolve. He admitted the exhaustion, the way his chest burned with every breath, the frostbite creeping into his fingertips. He even noted that he could barely feel the pen in his hand as he wrote. But the tone wasn't despairing. It was almost peaceful. "I thought this climb was about conquering Everest," he wrote. "But the truth is, it was always about conquering myself. Every step I take, every breath I fight for, it's proof that I refuse to be beaten by the things inside me." Then came the line that shook everyone who read it. "If I make it to the top, I'll know I've finally won. If I don't, then let this climb stand as proof that I tried, that I never gave in." His words were sharp, final, as though he knew this might be the last thing he ever wrote. The last sentences were almost illegible, the pen strokes scraping across the page. Some letters trailed into shaky lines, but the meaning was still there. "When they find me, if they ever do, I want them to know I wasn't running anymore. I was facing it. Every fear, every failure, every night I thought I couldn't keep going. I stood against it all. And even if the mountain takes me, I'll die knowing I climbed higher than I ever thought possible." And with that, the journal stopped. No farewell, no signature, just an unfinished line, a half-written word frozen in ink. The rescuers who read it said the air in the tent grew heavier. One mountaineer later whispered, "It didn't feel like reading words. It felt like hearing his last breath." That final entry spread through climbing circles like wildfire. Around campfires, climbers repeated his words with a kind of reverence. Some said it was foolishness, others said it was courage, but no one denied the raw honesty of it. Daniel Reeves hadn't just climbed a mountain. In those final words, he revealed a man who understood the true weight of life, that sometimes victory isn't standing on a summit, but refusing to bow to the storms inside yourself. And those who discovered him 2 years later, still frozen with that journal clutched in his hands, would carry his words with them forever. When the rescuers carried Daniel Reeves down the icy slopes, word of his discovery spread faster than the mountain winds. To the world, he became another headline, "Body of missing hiker found on Everest after 2 years." But to those who read his journal, he was something more. His words didn't fade with the snow, they echoed. Mount Everest had always been called the graveyard of climbers. Over 300 bodies still lie scattered across its unforgiving ridges, some serving as grim landmarks for others who dare the ascent. Most of those names vanish into silence, forgotten to all but their families. Yet Daniel's story lingered, carried from one camp to another, whispered in base tents lit by headlamps, repeated in quiet bars where climbers swapped tales of survival. Because, unlike most, Daniel left something behind, not just a body, but a voice. His journal became a kind of testament, a letter written not only to himself, but to anyone who had ever battled their own shadows. Back in Colorado, when his belongings were returned, his family held a memorial. Neighbors came, climbers he had once trained with came, even strangers came, people who had never met Daniel but had read his words online. They stood together in a modest church hall, listening to his sister read passages from the journal aloud. And in that moment, the man who had vanished into the silence of Everest spoke louder than ever. One by one, people shared stories. A childhood friend admitted he never realized how deeply Daniel had struggled. A fellow climber confessed he'd always dismissed Daniel as reckless. Until now, when he saw the climb not as recklessness but as resolve. And quietly, at the back of the room, two older hikers whispered to each other, "Crazy thing, huh? Freezing to death up there, just to prove a point. Maybe, or maybe it wasn't about proving anything to us. Maybe it was about proving it to himself." That was the difference. Daniel didn't set out to inspire anyone, but he did. His journal found its way online, circulating across forums, mental health blogs, climbing magazines. People read his words and felt them like sparks. Soldiers battling PTSD, students drowning in self-doubt, office workers trapped in cycles of failure. They all saw something of themselves in the frozen climber who refused to bow to his own fears. Mountaineers returning to Everest said they could feel his presence near Camp 4. One man claimed he passed the spot where Daniel was found and stopped, just to place his hand on the snow. "It wasn't about the summit anymore," he said later. "It was about remembering why we climb at all. To fight, to keep going." Daniel's family, at first torn by grief, later spoke of peace. His mother said she no longer saw Everest as the mountain that stole her son, but as the mountain that revealed who he really was. His father, a quiet man, once told a reporter, "He didn't run from life. He climbed straight into it." And for years after, young hikers who barely knew his name would carry copies of his final entry in their packs, as if the words themselves could shield them from the cold. The legacy of Daniel Reeves was not a failed summit. It was not a man who lost his way. It was the story of someone who faced himself on the highest point of Earth, stripped of everything except willpower, and left behind proof that he never surrendered. In the end, Everest kept his body, but his story descended the mountain, a frozen dream, held tight in one last journal, carried into the hearts of strangers across the world. And perhaps that's why, even in death, Daniel did what he set out to do. He conquered himself. Daniel's frozen body may never leave Everest, but his words live on. His journal wasn't just about climbing a mountain. It was about conquering the one inside himself. And maybe that's the real lesson. The greatest battles aren't fought on icy peaks, but in the silence of our own hearts. If this story gripped you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we've got more unbelievable true stories that'll leave you thinking long after the video ends.